Over the past 200 years, the percentage of the population employed in the agricultural sector has declined in both France and the United States, while employment in the service sector, which includes jobs in retail, consulting, real estate, etc., has risen. However, this transition happened at very different rates in the two countries. This can be seen most clearly by comparing the employment by sector in both countries in which choice most effectively uses data from the table to complete the statement. A. 1900 with the employment by sector in 1950. B. 1800 with the employment by sector in 2012. C. 1900 with the employment by sector in 2012. D. 1800 with the employment by sector in 1900.
Question number 14, we have to look at the data very carefully. This is showing employment by sector in France and the United States from 1800 to 2012. And you can clearly see that agriculture in France in 1800 is 64 and even in US 68. That is the percentage of total employment. That means quite a few in both US and France, they were employed in agriculture. But then it goes to the 40%, 43% in France and 41% in agriculture by 1900s. Then if you look at 1950, 32% it has become now. Whereas agriculture, it went off very, very less, 14% in US in 1950s itself. And agriculture in France by 2012 just 3% and 2% it has become now. Now, why we are looking at agriculture? Because in this question, over the past 200 years, the percentage of the population employed in the agricultural sector has declined in both France and the United States, while employment in the service sector, which includes jobs in retail, consulting, real estate, etc., that has risen. So, instead of agriculture, those jobs have gone to these other sectors. However, this transition happened at very different rates in the two countries. So, it has happened at different rates, and this can be most clearly seen by comparing the employment by sector in both countries in which year. Which one we have to choose? Now, first I already compared the agriculture in France to agriculture in US. Now, let us compare the other services. Now, 1800s, both France and US is low only, 14% in France and 13% services in US. And by 1900s, very close again, 28% in France and 31% in US for the services industry. Whereas if you observe in 1950, 35%, little bit only it has risen for France services, whereas for US it has increased to 53%. That's a little bit more compared to France. By 1950s, the services in US has gone quite high up. 53% has gone to services, and you see the decline in agriculture, 14%. And again, if you observe services in France, 76% in 2012 and 80% in the United States. Now, what do we have to do with this data? And we have to, where it is most clearly seen, which year, which choice most effectively uses data from the table to complete the statement. So, this has happened at different rates in the two countries, and which year we have to select to show this difference. Which 2 years we have to compare. So, if you said A, well done. 1900 with the employment by sector in 1950. Choice A is the best answer because it presents data from the table that most effectively complete the statement about the rates at which employment shifted in France and the United States. The text states that over the last 200 years, employment in the agricultural sector has declined, while employment in the service sector has risen in both France and the US. And the data from the table reflect these trends. The text asserts, however, that the transition from agriculture to services happened at different rates in the two countries. So, this assertion is best supported by the comparison of data from 1900 and 1950. The table shows that in those years, employment in agriculture went from 43% to 32% in France, a decline of 11%. So, you can observe over here, there is a massive decline, 11% decline in agriculture in that year from 1900 to 1950s. And then from 41% to 14%, as I mentioned, very drastic it has changed over here for US also. For US agriculture, 41% to 14%, very big decline. This is actually a decline of 27 percentage points. And what about employment in services? And employment in services, if you observe, they went up from 28% to 35% in France. This is an increase of 7%. And from 31% to 53% in US. This is an increase of 22 percentage points. So in other words, the rate of change was greater in the US than in France for both sectors. Now you observe that US 53% it has gone up to in services, and agriculture it has dropped also to 14%. This is drastic change compared to France's change. France only from 43 to 32 and 28 to 35 increase in services, and agriculture declined. But observe the large increase and decrease of US. Agriculture 41 to 14% and services 31 to 53%. So that clearly shows that the rate of change was greater in the US than in France for both sectors. So this clearly shows that it happened at two different rates in the two countries, this transition. So this can be best displayed from the data from 1900 to 1950.
Choice B is incorrect because comparing the data for 1800 and 2012 would suggest a similar rate of change in the two countries, not very different rates. Employment in agriculture went from 64% in 1800 to 3% in 2012 in France, which is close to the change from 68% in 1800 to 2% in 2012 in the US, while employment in services went from 14% in 1800 to 76% in 2012 in France, which is close to the change from 13% in 1800 to 80% in 2012 in the US. Choice C is incorrect because comparing the data for 1900 and 2012 would suggest a similar rate of change in the two countries rather than very different rates. Employment in agriculture went from 43% in 1900 to 3% in 2012 in France, which is close to the change from 41% in 1900 to 2% in 2012 in the US, while employment in services went from 28% in 1900 to 76% in 2012 in France, which is close to the change from 31% in 1900 to 80% in 2012 in the US. Choice D is incorrect because comparing the data for 1800 and 1900 would suggest a similar rate of change in the two countries, not very different rates. Employment in agriculture went from 64% in 1800 to 43% in 1900 in France, which is fairly close to the change from 68% in 1800 to 41% in 1900 in the US, while employment in services went from 14% in 1800 to 28% in 1900 in France, which is close to the change from 13% in 1800 to 31% in 1900 in the US.